Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello. Welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had an up and down week. Let's start with the down and get it out of the way. Throughout my life, I have had two best friends. Vanessa and I are sisters. I love this girl more than anyone can ever imagine. We literally live 5 minutes apart and have been beside each other for more than 20 years. She's the one who grounds me and one of the very few people in this world who can stop me before I say or do something stupid, as I tend to do sometimes. Love you, V. The other best friend is Carol. Carol and I met in high school, which was a long fucking time ago, as I'm no spring chicken anymore. But this past week marked the 5th anniversary of Carol passing from cervical cancer. Whenever she called me, I would answer, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Hey, bitch." I spent some time this week reminiscing on our 32 years together as besties, and it still hurts just as much as when I held her hand as she left. Grief sucks, but I look at it this way. If there was no grief, that would mean there was no love. So I am fortunate to have loved her and been loved by her. Fuck cancer, and get your goddamn pap tests. Now, on to the amazing good stuff. This past week, The Bitter Witness hit the 1,000 plays mark, which is absolutely fan-fucking-tastic. It's you. You did this. And I have to thank you for listening and helping to make my dreams come true. You can feel good about yourself because you're helping to put that $80,000 master degree hanging on my wall to good use. I appreciate everything you guys have done for me, the support, the sharing of the podcast, everything you do. It means so much to me, and I love you. That's about it that's been happening this week. Let's get into the business and get that out of the way. If you enjoy this or any other episode of The Bitter Witness, please head over to the Patreon page and support the show. It keeps the internet on so I can continue to bring you these episodes. You can also subscribe on Spotify, and if you're listening on Apple, please give the show a 5-star review. And that's enough of the business. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so Puppy ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea, sit back, relax, while I tell you about the murder of Blair Adams. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. Blair, and to all Blair's family and friends, I acknowledge you and I send my love to you wherever you may be. For the families of murder victims, the aftermath of suffering a violent loss often thrusts their grief, anger, and pain into the public eye. Grieving is never an isolated internal process. It unfolds amid the scrutinizing gaze of society. Those grieving are often caught between deeply personal emotions and public expectations. In navigating their sorrow, families often find themselves searching for a sense of closure. However, the term closure is complex. There is no solid definition of exactly what closure is. Does one achieve closure when justice has been dealt to those responsible for taking away a loved one? Do we attain closure when we lay a loved one to rest? Does time allow the pain to subside and eventually allow one to accept the death of a murdered family member? Is closure even conceivable for those families who receive no justice for the murder of their loved one? Those left with more questions than answers. The unsolved murder of a loved one weighs on family members indefinitely. Could I have done something to prevent this? Who would do this to my loved one? And perhaps the most important question, why? Sadly, closure is something that you and I will have to define for ourselves. God forbid we are ever faced with the unsolved murder of a family member. But for the family members of Blair Adams, there are more questions than answers. There has been no justice, and to this day, any kind of closure is a pipe dream for his family, who still ask, what happened to Blair? Robert Dennis Blair Adams was born on December 28, 1964, and at the time of his murder, he was 31 years old. He was working as a foreman at his stepfather's construction company in Surrey, British Columbia, and was an all-around happy and good guy. Blair was described as loving his work in construction and was known for doing a good job and doing it with a smile. All in all, Blair seemed to have a great life. He had lots of friends, he had a good job, he traveled on occasion, and he had no issues obtaining partners. According to his mother, he had dated both men and women over the years and was liked by everyone who knew him. He really just seemed good in all aspects of his life. But early in the summer of 1996, Blair's cheerful demeanor started to fade. According to his mother, Sandra Edwards, Blair started acting differently. Blair was 2 years sober at this point, but he had stopped going to AA. Sandra knew something was wrong. His moods would switch on a dime from agitated paranoia to sullen and withdrawn. He wasn't sleeping, and his work started to suffer. Blair was forgetting things that would normally be second nature to a longtime foreman of a construction company, such as forgetting to lock up the job sites at the end of the day and little things like that. According to an article in the Knoxville News Sentinel from 2017, this odd behavior had been going on for a while, and some of his coworkers had even suggested that Blair go see a doctor and make sure he was okay. Blair became paranoid and told his mother that people were spreading rumors about him. Blair's mother started cautiously asking Blair if there was something going on. She was terrified that perhaps her son had fallen off the wagon. But when she would ask Blair what was going on, Blair would just reply, "I don't think I should tell you about it." And according to Sandra, she never did find out what it was. On July 5th, 1996, Blair went to his bank and took everything out of his accounts and his safety deposit box. According to reports, he left the bank with $6,000 in cash and thousands of dollars more in gold, jewelry, and platinum. The next time we see Blair is on Sunday, July 7th at the U.S. border crossing. He tried to gain entry into the States, but because he was a young man, single, and carrying a lot of cash and jewelry, the border agents felt he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and they refused him entry. On Monday, July 8th, Blair appeared at the worksite. He told his boss he didn't think he could carry on there, and he quit on the spot. He asked his boss for his paycheck, but the boss said that Blair would have to come back to give them time to write the check. But Blair never picked up that check. Later that same afternoon, Blair bought a one-way ticket to Frankfurt, Germany, costing him $1,600. Blair had gone to Germany before and even had a girlfriend there. His stepfather's company had done work there, and Blair had accompanied him on some trips. The flight was scheduled to leave on the next day, July 9th. But later that night, Blair showed up at a friend's house in a panic, begging her to drive him over the border. He told his friend that someone was trying to kill him and he had to get into the U.S. right away. But his friend told Blair that she couldn't take him because her kids were sleeping and she couldn't leave her kids alone in the house. Blair left just as panicked as when he arrived at her house. I found it reported that that night Blair went to his mother's house instead of going to his own and stayed the night. The next day, July 9th, Blair shows up at the airport, but instead of getting on the plane to Germany, Blair returned his ticket and rented a Nissan. Then he heads to the border again. This time, he tries to cross at the Peace Arch crossing, which is about the same distance from Surrey as the previous place he tried to cross. This time, he managed to gain entry into the United States. Blair makes it to Seattle, Washington by 4 p.m. Here, he purchases a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. The detective looking into Blair's case stated that he found this very odd because Blair could have bought a round-trip ticket to Washington, D.C. from Seattle for about $350 to $400, but instead he purchased the one-way ticket, which cost him $770. On Wednesday, July 10th, Blair arrived in D.C. early. He rented a white Toyota and headed out to Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville is approximately 500 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., which means he was basically backtracking. According to the detectives looking into this case in Knoxville, Blair had absolutely no reason to be in Tennessee or Knoxville. He had no connections there and knew absolutely no one. Later on that evening, July 10th, Blair is now at a gas station in Knoxville. This is around 5:30 p.m. Here, at this gas station, Blair has an interaction with a worker. Blair told the worker that his car wouldn't start. So, the mechanic went out to have a look at Blair's car to try and help him out. Blair handed him the keys, and the mechanic realized that the keys that Blair handed him were for the Nissan car, not a Toyota. The Nissan was the car that he had used to get from Surrey, BC to Seattle, Washington. But Blair insisted to the worker that those were the only keys he had on him and that they were for the Toyota that was sitting in front of them. The mechanic said, "You drove the car here, so you have to have the keys. This is not the key." Blair seemed a little agitated and maybe a little confused to the mechanic. So the mechanic says, "Okay, buddy, let's look for the keys together. Empty out your pockets and we'll see what's there." So I found what happened next reported two different ways. In one, Blair empties out his pocket, but there was no key to the Toyota. In another report, I found that Blair refused to empty his pockets. So I don't know which happened. Either way, the mechanic told Blair, "You know what? Don't worry about it. You can go to the car rental company tomorrow and get it sorted out." Because at that point, the car rental company was closed for the night. Blair was stuck in Knoxville. The mechanic then arranged to have Blair's car towed to the rental company and got Blair a ride to a local hotel with the tow truck driver. At the hotel, the security camera footage shows Blair coming in and out of the lobby of the hotel 5 different times in an hour. After those 5 times of going in and out, he finally approaches the counter where Tika Hartfield was working. Tika stated the best way to describe him would be paranoid. He was just very nervous, agitated, expecting someone to come in on him even though there wasn't anybody there. I don't know who he was looking for, but he was waiting for somebody to walk in for him. At 7:37 p.m. on July 10th, Blair paid for a room with a $100 bill, pocketed the key that Tika handed him, and walked out the door. He didn't take his change. And that is the last time that we see Blair Adams alive. At approximately 7:30 a.m. on July 11th, in an under-construction hotel parking lot at 7471 Crosswood Boulevard off the Strawberry Plains Pike exit for Interstate 40, which is about a half a mile from the hotel, construction workers came upon Blair's body. Blair was naked from the waist down. His shirt was ripped open, and there were items strewn about the body. Law enforcement stated that from the looks of the crime scene, it seemed as though someone had taken Blair's pants off of him, as opposed to him taking them off himself. They said that his pants were inside out, laying on the ground, like someone grabbed the waist and pulled them all the way down his legs. His shoes were off, and his socks were off. One of his shoes was laying near the body. The other shoe was tucked under his head like a pillow. In Blair's hand, a long strand of someone else's hair was found. I couldn't find a description of this hair anywhere. It hasn't been made public, which is probably normal. They're probably keeping it close to the vest because I think this is the only clue they have. In the area surrounding Blair's body, there was approximately $4,000 in Canadian, American, and German currency. A black duffel bag was found close by, which contained receipts for Blair's recent travel expenses and different road maps. As well, there was a black fanny pack close to the body. Inside, there was approximately $2,000 in jewelry and gold, a pair of sunglasses, and more keys. The owner of a siding company that was working at the construction site, this is so shitty, pocketed a $100 bill and a $10 bill from the cash strewn about Blair's body. You are an absolute piece of shit. You just stole from a dead man. Karma's gonna get you. According to police, they were able to later retrieve those bills that the siding company owner had stolen out of the crime scene. One more thing that was found on the ground, about 10 feet from Blair's body, was the key to the Toyota rental car. Remember I told you about the shoe that was under Blair's head, like a pillow almost. According to law enforcement, they feel that Blair himself pulled off his shoe and put it under his head like a pillow. Blair suffered several minor cuts and bruises, which the police attributed to Blair fending off his attacker or attackers. There were also large clumps of Blair's hair that had been torn out of his head. The autopsy report deemed the cause of death a severe blow to the abdomen, which ruptured his stomach, causing Blair to die from septic shock. As well, there was a large laceration on his forehead, which the police believe was most likely made by a hammer or a crowbar. Toxicology reports on Blair showed no drugs or alcohol in his system, so he hadn't fallen off the wagon. Law enforcement state that they feel as though the threats to his life that Blair perceived were imaginary, and that this giant road trip that he went on was just his attempt to escape the delusions he was suffering from. Either way, Blair was killed, so maybe they weren't delusions. Law enforcement state that they believe that the attack that took Blair's life occurred at approximately 3:30 a.m., and they feel that way because a security guard at a nearby business reported hearing a woman scream at 3:30 a.m. That is all they're basing the time of death on. There's nothing scientific that points to any solid time of death for Blair. To this day, the case remains open and unsolved. And that's what we know about the death of Blair Adams. Now let's dive into this a little bit more. First of all, I want to look at him being refused entry into the States. I can see them refusing entry to him under suspicion of being a drug trafficker. But they had to have conducted a search on his person to know that he had all that cash and jewelry on him, which means at the time that he was denied entry at the first attempt of crossing the border, Blair had to be acting rational. Otherwise, they would have detained him at the border. Let's look at his job. He quit his job, and he was working for family, his stepdad. Usually when you quit a job with family, it's because you either have had a falling out with the family, or you're moving on to something better like school or a job that you've been working towards. You don't just quit and say you can't carry on anymore for no reason. But there's never been any inkling that there was any animosity between Blair and his family. So why did he quit? The next thing we have to look at is when law enforcement find it weird, for lack of a better word, that Blair would buy a one-way ticket from Seattle to Washington. Yeah, it seems a little odd that he would pay double what he could have paid, but we don't know if that ticket agent even gave him that option, or if they just sold him what he asked for. If Blair went to the counter and said, I want to buy a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C., maybe the ticket agent just said, okay, sir, here you go. That's $770. It has been my experience that most ticket agents will try and get you the best deal they can, but you never know. Maybe the demeanor that Blair had at that time was, give me what I want, and that's all I want. I don't want to hear anything else. Remember, he's been up for quite a while now, driving. He's probably tired. Plus, according to his family and friends, he was acting paranoid and panicked and agitated. So his body was probably physically exhausted. I want to move on to the route that Blair took in getting to Knoxville. Seattle to Washington, then Washington to Knoxville. And if you look at a map of the United States, Seattle is on the west coast of the states, and Washington, D.C. is literally across the country on the east coast. But then Knoxville is almost dead center of the country and a little south from the flight path from Seattle to Washington, D.C. Blair would have been better off to take a flight directly to Knoxville from Seattle, but maybe it wasn't available. The drive from Washington, D.C. to Knoxville is like an 8-hour drive. In my mind, there's only two possibilities why he didn't take a flight directly to Knoxville. One, it wasn't his final destination. Or two, there wasn't a direct flight available, or not available in the time frame that he wanted. But there probably was flights that would have gotten him closer than DC if Knoxville was his actual final destination. Now, I want to move on to the jewelry and gold that Blair had on him. How does anybody know how many thousands of dollars of gold, jewelry, and platinum Blair had in his safety deposit box? The only way I can see that people would know how much is if he was searched at the border when he was denied. I'd like to know exactly how much he had when he was at the border and denied entry, and exactly how much he was found with. The fact that there's $2,000 missing in the cash, that doesn't shock me because he's bought plane tickets, he's bought rental cars, he probably bought food and gas on his road trip. So I'm not worried about the $2,000, but I am concerned about the jewelry and gold and platinum. As I said before, there are just so many questions in this case, but I do believe it is solvable. One more thing that I found curious about this whole case. Blair was in AA and he stopped going. But in AA, everyone has a sponsor, right? From what I know of AA, the job of your sponsor is to mentor, give advice, and support and assist you in completing the 12 steps. I'm curious if the friend that Blair went to that night, asking him to take him over the border, if that was his sponsor. And I'm not trying to victim blame in any way, and it may sound like I am, but I'm not. But whether she was his sponsor or not, that woman that he went to and in a panic and agitated and paranoid, I would assume, and maybe I shouldn't assume, but she would know who Blair's family was. Surrey, it is a big city, but it's not, you know? You have your circles of people, and if you're a good friend of Blair, good enough that he would come to you in the middle of the night and beg you to take you over the border, my guess is that you know who his family is. Why didn't she call someone and tell them that Blair was at her door at 1 a.m. trying to get over the border? If one of my friends showed up at 1 a.m. asking me to take them over the border and in a panic and paranoid and telling me that someone was trying to kill them, I would do everything in my power to get them to come inside my house, or I would be going with them. Now, I know she had children and she couldn't. I know she couldn't leave them alone, but why didn't she call someone? Did she not make a phone call because it wasn't strange for Blair to act in this weird paranoia way? Was this something that had happened before? Was Blair acting rational when he asked her to take him over the border? Maybe he wasn't paranoid. Maybe he just said, I need to get over the border. And I tried earlier and they wouldn't let me in. I need you to take me. I just wonder. Now, in the news article from 2017, Blair's mother is quoted as saying that Blair's entire purpose of this trip was to attend the Olympics in Atlanta that year. The report then goes on to say that she never told police this. And I can't find anything anywhere of her mentioning that Blair told her anything. Maybe Blair told her that last night that he stayed at her house, but I don't know, that just seems way out of left field. If Blair was heading to the Atlanta Olympics, why did he buy a ticket to Germany first and then a ticket to DC? Why didn't he just buy a ticket to Atlanta? Now, it does make sense, though, in the direction that he was driving to go through Knoxville on his way to Atlanta, but it doesn't explain why he went all the way to Washington, D.C. Just so many questions. It's so frustrating. I also would like to see the police focus a little bit more on the owner of the siding company, the asshat who stole $110 from the crime scene. This literally shows a level of disrespect for human life that has absolutely no limit. I can only hope that the Knoxville police did a thorough background search on this shit snake and got his DNA to test against the strands of hair found in Blair's hand. I want to move on to the shoe under the head. I have problems with what the law enforcement say on this one. I don't think that Blair took that shoe off himself and put it under his head, because his pants were taken off in a way that looked like someone had pulled them off from his waist down. And I don't think that someone who is in the throes of a fight or attempting to murder someone or sexually assaulting Blair would take the time to take his shoes off while they're pulling their pants off. No. They would pull the pants from the waist all the way down the legs, and the shoes would come off either with the pants or after the pants. I don't think that Blair, like the shoes would be inside the legs of the pants, you know? I don't think that Blair took those shoes off at all. I think someone else put that shoe under his head as a pillow. I think it was someone who came upon the murder scene prior to the construction workers who called it in, and they felt bad, and they just did not want to be caught up in a murder case, and they felt horrible that Blair had been murdered, and put the shoe under his head as a sign of, I feel bad that you're dead, have a pillow, I guess. Or the person who killed Blair had remorse for killing him, meaning they didn't mean to kill him, and they put that shoe under his head as a pillow. That's the only thing I can think of. I have read literally thousands of court documents, murder cases, books on murder, just so much. And I have never once in my life heard of a person who is actively dying, removing their shoe and putting it under their head as a pillow. I hope and pray to God they sealed that shoe in a bag and fingerprinted it. And now, with the way that science and technology has evolved, that shoe could possibly be tested for touch DNA. When you touch something with your hands, you leave oil. Your fingers leave oil on it. If someone else touched that shoe, there is DNA on it, and that could help us find the killer or find someone who came upon the scene. Now, this part I have some issues with. Law enforcement state that they believe Blair was sexually assaulted, but they couldn't say when the assault occurred. And they also stated that there was no DNA evidence of a sexual assault. How can you say it appeared that he was sexually assaulted? I want to know what they're basing that statement on. In the Unsolved Mysteries episode of this case, they show a little bit of the autopsy. And if you look at it, there is a line that runs to the center of the buttocks on the diagram of a human body. And at the end of that line, it says, anal laceration. I'm wondering if the police saw that anal laceration and jumped to the conclusion of sexual assault. But I think that laceration in the buttocks area was probably something he got either from defending himself from his attacker or when he fell on the ground. If he fell butt first and landed on a rock, he would end up with a laceration in that area. I don't think that means sexual assault. In several Reddit dives that I went for this case, many people that saw the autopsy report think, and this I just think is a ginormous leap, but everyone is entitled to think what they think. On my Reddit dives, I found it more than once, more than 10 times, that a lot of people think that this was some kind of drug deal gone wrong, that Blair was some kind of a mule and was trafficking drugs over the border. The people on Reddit believe that the sexual assault that the law enforcement think happened was actually a cavity search by whoever Blair was muling these drugs for. So they think that Blair shows up at the designated time to drop off the drugs, something goes bad, and whoever Blair is giving these drugs to kills him, strips him naked from the waist down, and then does a cavity search to find their drugs. I just don't believe that. I think that is a huge leap, and I also think that there would be many, many, many more signs of a forcible cavity search done on Blair than one tiny laceration. On the autopsy report that was shown on Unsolved Mysteries, there is no indication of penetration or tearing of the buttocks area, which in the case of a sexual assault would be present. Again, this is just my opinion, but I think people let drama cloud their judgment. Look at the facts and go by the facts. At the end of the day, there is a mother who desperately wants to know what happened to her child. Whether Blair was 6, 16, 28, or 78, it wouldn't matter. He was taken away from his family, and there needs to be justice. There needs to be answers. My thoughts. The pulling of Blair's hair, pulling of the clumps out of Blair's head, makes me think of a girl fight. That is always the first things girls go for in a fight, is the hair. It's always the fucking hair. God, I hate that. Men don't pull each other's hair out in a fight. And if this was an attack on Blair, they would have been punching him and trying to take him down to the ground quickly. To pull a clump of hair out of a head, especially shorter hair like Blair had at the time, takes a little bit more time. And if Blair is still conscious and fighting back, as the autopsy says he did, a man wouldn't waste his time trying to yank out the hair. They want something that will incapacitate him fast. And I really can't see anyone, either man or woman, pulling out several clumps of hair after Blair was dead. What would the purpose of that be? So you've killed him. It's over. You need to get the fuck away from there or you're going to be caught. Why would you take the time it would take to pull several clumps of hair out of this man's head? My gut is telling me this was a woman. We had a friend a few years ago, and he was working around his house or something, and he cut his leg. And he didn't think much of it, and he just left it. Just a cut that you get, you know. And maybe a week, maybe a bit longer than a week, but it was very fast. He was dead from sepsis. Blair worked at a construction site. He could have gotten a small laceration anywhere on his body and thought nothing of it. It could have gotten infected, which in time would turn to sepsis, which would then turn to septic shock, which would kill him. Septic shock takes a while. It's not something that happens right away. You first become sepsis, and then you get septic shock. The very first symptom of sepsis is change in mental status. There's also fast, shallow breathing, shivering, along with a host of other symptoms that go along with it. After a while, with untreated sepsis, it then turns to septic shock, which then will result in a major change in mental status, and if left untreated, eventually death. There is no timeline as to when sepsis will turn to septic shock. I think that Blair had sepsis before he ever left Surrey, BC. I think he got a cut on the job site, maybe at home, whatever, wherever, it doesn't matter. And his mental status started changing. In came the paranoia. Then he had to get away. And I think maybe in his altered state, when Blair arrived in Knoxville and left the hotel that night, I think he might have hired a sex worker. And I think something went wrong. I think Blair was attacked, or even maybe, and I'm not victim blaming, but maybe Blair initiated an attack on the sex worker in his altered mental state. And whoever killed him was fighting back or attacking. Either way, Blair ended up dead at the end of it. Maybe they didn't mean for him to die, and that's why they put the shoe under his head to show remorse. I also think that the attack happened very close to the time he was found. The reason I think this is because other than the $110 that the shit snake owner of the siding company took, none of the other money was missing. There was cash, gold, jewelry, platinum lying around the body openly. Anyone walking by would have stolen that money and that jewelry. That's why I think it happened very close to when Blair was found. I think the sun was beginning to come up and the killer knew that construction workers would be coming, people would start going to work, people would be leaving the hotels, etc. And they were terrified they were going to be caught, and they ran. I think it's as simple as that. And I think that if the DNA testing on that strand of hair hasn't been done, it needs to be done. And I pray to God they stored it properly all these years, because it can still be done. And familial DNA research can be done to find that person. Maybe that person is deceased if they were living a high risk lifestyle, like what I think happened. But at least we would know what happened. Blair's mother, Sandra, stated in an interview that she wants Blair back, but she knows that can't happen. She said that at the very least, it would be nice for her to have some understanding as to why Blair died. Crime seems to elicit in victims a desire for the truth. Knowing the actual details of the crime, such as why it occurred, whether there was suffering, who committed the crime, may alleviate some emotional and psychological pain felt by those left behind. If truth is its own reward, there may be some kind of psychological healing in knowing what happened. Whether it be confusing, difficult, or hard to reconcile, by allowing Sandra to have the full story of the death of her son, it may allow her to heal and start to move forward from the pain she feels every moment of every day. I don't like to use the word closure because I don't believe closure is a concrete thing. The term implies a finality that feels almost deceptive when navigating the complex landscape of grief. When a loved one is taken away from us, whether through sickness, natural causes, or crime, the space they occupied in our hearts does not close or vanish. It remains an open wound. This absence is palpable, a void that can never truly be filled. Time passes, and while our minds gradually learn to accept the absence, our hearts adapt in a different way. Rather than closing the door on that love or memory, we learn to embrace it, allowing our hearts to hold on to the memories, the laughter, and the lessons learned. Instead of finding closure, we cultivate a new relationship with our grief, where the love we shared coexists with the pain of absence. It's as if the heart becomes a reservoir where joy intermingles with sorrow. And in this way, the memory of the departed remains alive, enriching our lives even in their physical absence. Well, that was a horrifically sad case. I really think this case is solvable. I think with DNA and familial DNA, the person who did this to Blair can be found and brought to justice. Who knows, maybe someday they'll pull off their pantyhose, man up, and contact police and admit to what they did. If you have any information regarding the murder of Blair Adams, please call the Knox County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit at 865-215-3520, or you can email them at coldcase@knoxsheriff.org, and I will put that contact information up on the Bitter Witness Facebook page and in the show notes as well. I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, Get your pap test done, girls, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.